lecture on learning. We're going to continue our talk on different processes of learning. And if you remember from last time, we went through classical conditioning in Pavlov and his dogs, and classical conditioning again, that type of learning where we're making associations. We're learning like a conditioned stimulus predicts an unconditioned stimulus leading to a conditioned response. So we finished off starting to talk about operant or instrumental conditioning. And we talked about Thorndike and his puzzle boxes, saw a brief video about Thorndike's puzzle box. And so now we're moving on to another important person to know in operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner, one of the fathers of the school of behaviorism, which really dominated psychology in the 20th century. Skinner is known for his work on operant conditioning, and particularly what eventually came to be known as the Skinner box. So Skinner, very much like Thorndike, wanted to understand these reinforcing properties of behavior. So he thought that any random movement as operating on the environment, that we are just going through our day, operating on the environment. And that's why he called it operant conditioning. And if a behavior was rewarding, that would reinforce the likelihood of the behavior happening again. So instead of Thorndike's puzzle boxes, we have Skinner's operant chambers, or what became known as Skinner boxes. So these operant chambers worked very much like the puzzle box. Skinner would put a pigeon or a rat inside them and eventually train them to do certain things. So for instance, if they pushed on a lever in the Skinner box, they might be reinforced for that behavior with a little food pellet or some water. So Skinner's experiments with the Skinner box or the operant chamber showed that these animals were responding to things in their environment. They were being reinforced for their behaviors. And he made the distinction here. He called these stimulus that occurred in response to behavior reinforcers. So reinforcers were a stimulus that followed a response and increased the likelihood that that behavior or that response would happen again in the future. So making a distinction from classical conditioning, where the stimulus is followed by a response, here in operant conditioning, your response or your behavior is followed by a reinforcer or a stimulus. So I have a brief video about a Skinner box.
Because he's been taught to distinguish between two words to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. The first task was to isolate an individual piece of behavior and see how that could be changed. Skinner did this by keeping individual pigeons at about 3/4 of their normal weight, so that the birds were always hungry, and food could be used as an automatic reward. The pigeon was studied in a uniform box, one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a coloured disc, was measured on a graph. The pigeon learned that pecking the disc produced a reward. Then the behavior of pecking could be studied in relation to how often that reward was offered, or in Skinner's terms, what was the schedule of reinforcement?
Okay, so Skinner was basically reinforcing behaviors. The bird wasn't learning how to read turn. Unfortunately, the bird wasn't that good. But the pigeon was learning that if they made that movement in turn, they'd be reinforced by getting food. And Skinner made the distinction between primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers were things that basically helped us live. Food, water, safety. Secondary reinforcers were anything that wasn't a primary reinforcer. So reinforcement can come in a lot of different forms, and we need to make the distinction between positive reinforcers and negative reinforcers. So in positive reinforcement, something is added, a stimulus is added, and the addition of that stimulus increases the likelihood of that behavior happening again in the future. So If you gave your significant other a really great Valentine's Day gift last week, you might have gotten a positive reinforcement in the form of a hug or a kiss or something that made you want to then give them a nice gift again next year. With negative reinforcement, something is taken away. Something is removed. A stimulus is removed, but again, the net effect is to increase the likelihood of that behavior again in the future. So for instance, if you wanted, as a parent, your child to eat all their fruits and vegetables for dinner, you might say, eat all your fruits and vegetables, and you don't have to do your chores for the evening. Something would be taken away, your chores, but the net effect would be to increase the likelihood of your child eating fruits and vegetables at dinner the next night. So positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Now, if a reward or a reinforcement is given every single time, if that stimulus followed the behavior every single time, we would call that continuous reinforcement. So if something is continuously reinforcing, every time you perform that behavior, you'd be reinforced. But that's not generally the way the world really works. Every single time you do something, you're not reinforced for it. A more common form of reinforcement is what we call partial reinforcement. And there are several schedules of partial reinforcement that we're going to talk about. In partial reinforcement, the reward or the reinforcer is given on a variable schedule. So it's not given every single time that you perform the behavior. So think about when you hold the door open for someone. Does the person always say thank you? Every single time in your life that you've held the door open for someone, being polite and nice, did they say thank you or respond with a smile? No, probably not. But we keep doing it. We keep doing it because we're partially reinforced. And with partial reinforcement, hope springs eternal. Hope springs eternal that in the future, maybe they didn't thank me this time, but maybe the next time I hold the door for someone, they will thank me. Continuous reinforcement is very quick to be learned. If you're getting reinforced every single time you do something, it's really quick to learn to pick that association up. But it's also very quick to extinguish that. If every single time you held the door open for someone, you didn't get reinforced, no one said thank you, you'd probably stop doing that really quickly. But partial reinforcement, while slower to learn, it's also much tougher to extinguish. Much tougher to extinguish. Okay, so there are 4 schedules of partial reinforcement we're going to talk about. 4 schedules of reinforcement along 2 general dimensions. So the combination of these 2 dimensions gets you 4 schedules of partial reinforcement. So first you have interval versus ratio. Interval versus ratio. So with interval reinforcement, you're reinforced based on a certain amount of time passing. Certain amount of time passing. With ratio, you're reinforced based on your certain number of responses. A certain number of responses have to be performed before you are reinforced for that behavior. And then these can be fixed or variable. So fixed meaning on a fixed schedule, variable meaning on a variable schedule. So you have these 4 combinations. The first one we're going to talk about is a fixed ratio schedule. Fixed ratio, where your behavior is reinforced after you perform it a certain set number of times. So if you do something a certain number of times, after the X amount of times, you're going to be reinforced for it. So think about when you go to a coffee shop and they have you fill out those little punch cards, you buy 10 lattes, you get the 11th one free. There you go, fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. Okay, next we have variable ratio. And variable ratio is by far the most common schedule of partial reinforcement that we encounter in our lives. By far the most common. Gambling. Gambling is the big one we point to here. Vegas is built on the idea of variable ratio reinforcement. Think about if you've ever gambled. The idea being that you could win on the first try, you could win on the 5th try, you could win on the 50th try. It varies. You don't know when you're going to win, but you always think you have a chance. That's what gets you. You always think you have a chance, even though really you should know the house is always going to win. So variable ratio reinforcement schedules are particularly good for keeping human beings persisting in a certain type of behavior. Because again, you always are thinking you have a shot on the next chance. All right, next, we have fixed interval responses. Fixed interval responses are responses that reinforce after a fixed time period. So again, if you look at this chart, you can see the x-axis is time. We're again looking at this sort of orange squiggly line. And those black bars are when the behavior is reinforced. So it's at a fixed amount of time that your behavior is going to be reinforced. Think about those of you who use eBay. When the bid is getting closer and closer, you're going to be checking on it more. It's really the last 30 seconds, right? It's the last 30 seconds of an eBay auction where you're like really on there all the time, and that's when the action happens. And you can see that happening in this line. The closer you get to the black bar, there's a little spike in activity. Your responses are going to go up. Then once that reinforcement occurs, it plateaus out. There's a little plateau because you know nothing's going to happen for another X amount of time. Okay, and then finally, we have variable interval schedules. Variable interval schedules are, of course, behavior is reinforced after variable amounts of time. You don't know how much time it's going to take. So this is something like checking email. Whether or not you get an email in response really doesn't depend on how many times you check it. You're going to get email maybe every 5 minutes, every 2 minutes, every 10 minutes. So this leads to pretty, slow and steady responding. Okay. So we talked about reinforcement, increasing the likelihood of your behavior happening again in the future. We also have to talk about punishment. And it's important to make this distinction. Reinforcement, increasing the likelihood of a behavior happening again. Punishment, you're trying to decrease the likelihood of a behavior happening again. We've all been punished. We all know what this means. But again, we have to distinguish between positive and negative. Just like reinforcement schedules have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, so does punishment have positive punishment and negative punishment. So with positive punishment, we're talking about something being added. A stimulus being added to decrease the likelihood of you doing that again in the future. So if you park in the wrong place, you're going to get a ticket, which will probably decrease the likelihood of you parking in that wrong place again in the future. Positive punishment. As opposed to negative punishment, where if you're driving a little recklessly and the police catch you, they may take your license away. So something's being taken away with the hope that that decreases the likelihood you drive recklessly again in the future. So negative punishment, taking something away. Now, a lot of people ask, especially after they become parents, does punishment work? Does punishment work? Well, for punishment to be effective, it really needs to be reasonable, it needs to be fairly unpleasant, and it needs to be applied immediately. So children make that quick connection. They need to make the quick connection between why they're being punished. So the relationship is clear. But a lot of researchers have asked, does punishment in general work? And there are some definite drawbacks to punishment. First, punished behavior might just be suppressed, not forgotten. The child may not be learning to stop doing that behavior. They might just suppress it, particularly in front of the parents. A child may also learn to discriminate. In the sense they learn, okay, I won't do that behavior around my parents, but I'll try and get away with it at school. Or I'll try and get away with it in my friend's parents' house. Something like that. Punishment can also teach fear. A child can learn to be afraid of the punisher, can learn to be afraid of the parent. And physical punishment can be particularly dangerous because research has shown that children who experience physical punishment, corporal punishment, can be more aggressive themselves. So what they might be learning is not to stop the behavior, but they might be learning that aggression is okay, that physical aggression is okay. So what's the take-home message from this? Punishment works best when it's combined with reinforcement. Punishment, again, tells you what not to do, right? You're trying to stop a behavior. It doesn't necessarily tell you what to do instead. So punishment when combined with reinforcement. So reinforcing a child for what they should do instead of what they should not be doing. Okay, so because this is an important distinction, I just want to spend one more slide on making it clear. Differences between positive and negative punishment and reinforcement. So we have these two dimensions, likelihood of response increasing or decreasing, and response causes a stimulus to be presented or removed. So here we have positive reinforcement. So you want to increase the likelihood of the response happening by causing a stimulus to be presented. So studying and getting good grades. So if you study and then you get good grades as a result of studying, that's positively reinforcing. It's going to increase the likelihood of you studying again in the future. Negative reinforcement. Again, you want to increase the behavior, but you want to take something away. So if you go to study at the library to get away from really loud roommates, that's going to increase the likelihood of you studying again because it's going to make it easier. It's going to make it easier to focus, so you're more likely to study again in the future. You've still taken something away. You've taken away the loud roommates. And then over here on punishment, we've got positive punishment. We want to decrease the behavior by taking something away. So if I'm a parent, my child comes home late, I might give them extra chores. I might add something onerous and decrease the likelihood of them coming home late again in the future. Whereas with negative punishment, I want to take something away. So if they come home late, I might take away their video games in the hope that they won't come home late again. So I'm going to take something away. Okay. Reinforcement and punishment. However, sometimes behavior is a little more complex. We all do slightly more complex behaviors than that. So how do you get there? Something called shaping. In order to acquire more complex behaviors, we do something called shaping. So with shaping, you use something called a method of successive approximation, where you reinforce a behavior in steps. You reinforce the behavior in steps until you get closer and closer to the actual desired behavior. So you can't just plop a cat down on a toilet seat and expect it to use a toilet. You have to train the cat. You can't just automatically assume they're going to understand, no, you were using a litter box yesterday, but today I want you to use the toilet. There are actually many steps you have to go through. So you actually have to get the litter box closer and closer to the toilet. Then you've got to put the litter box on top of the toilet. And once the cat learns to use it there, then you take the litter box away and replace it with some saran wrap or something like that and put the litter on there. And then once the cat learns that, eventually you can get rid of that altogether. And hopefully if it's worked and the cat's accommodating, they've learned to use the toilet. So you're reinforcing all these steps on the way to get to this more complex behavior. Okay. Are there biological constraints on learning? Are there constraints on things we can learn, or can we learn anything? Well, some of Skinner's students, our friend Skinner with the operant chamber, Skinner box, some of his students eventually went on to become very famous animal trainers. So when you go to SeaWorld or something like that, it's a direct result of the reinforcing principles that Skinner's students kind of passed on to animal trainers everywhere. Even they, though, had a lot of difficulty with certain types of training. There were some things they just couldn't get the animals to learn to do because they violated the animals' natural tendencies. That there are certain things we just seem to not be able to learn because they violate our natural tendencies. So even though behaviorists believed that any behavior could be shaped through reinforcement, it might take successive approximations, right? It might take a little work, but behaviorists believed you could shape anything. However, again, there do seem to be these innate tendencies that we have that you can't violate. So no amount of training, no amount of conditioning can instill learning for certain things. On the flip side of that, there do seem to be certain things we can learn more easily. So if you think about phobias, think about the phobias that your friends or family members have or that you've seen quite a bit in people. There seem to be certain common ones, like phobias of snakes, phobias of spiders, fear of heights. These are really common ones, and they also seem to go along with evolutionary adaptiveness. It's adapted to be afraid of heights. It's adapted to be afraid of snakes. Blood and needle phobias are also very common, and you could see how those would be adaptive. And some research by Sue Meinica and Oman, they started with monkeys, and they showed that it was really easy to train a monkey to be afraid of snakes. Really easy. Easy to condition a monkey to be afraid of snakes. Much easier than to condition the monkey to be afraid of something like flowers. You just can't do it. You can't train a monkey to be afraid of flowers. You can train the monkey to be afraid of snakes, though. Same things with humans. Research with very small children, young as 1 or 2 years old, has shown that these children seem to have an innate tendency to associate snakes with fear. They don't have phobias yet. They don't have a full-blown phobia. They're too young for that, and that's what's so interesting. They haven't had a chance yet to develop or learn a phobia, but they still seem to associate snakes with fear emotions, even more so than something like a knife. And a knife is a scary thing, and you could see how someone might have a fear of knives. But no, again, these young children are quick to associate snakes and spiders with fear, but not knives and not flowers. So there do seem to be these innate tendencies to learn to develop fears of certain things. Okay. So behaviorism. Behaviorism based on operant conditioning or instrumental conditioning principles was a huge and important school of psychology in the 20th century. Skinner went on to write novels, and he, along with John Watson, remember Watson from our study of little Albert, how he conditioned fear in poor little Albert, which extended beyond the white rat to other white furry things. Skinner and Watson really rejected the idea of studying things like introspection or consciousness, which you've recently gotten lectures on. Consciousness was really what psychology was all about, introspection, when it started. But Skinner and Watson rejected that. They rejected the idea of understanding what a person's mental experience was. Instead, they wanted to focus on behavior, observable behavior. Watson said the appropriate subject of psychological science is behavior as distinct from the mind. That private mental events or states don't play a role at all in the chain of causal events leading to behavior, and so they're irrelevant to psychology. So he really led an assault on introspection as a place of research in psychology. He thought things like mental contracts, like decision-making, memory, those things were just baggage, excess baggage, and psychologists should focus on observable, learned behavior. So if you can imagine a psychologist on the cover of Time magazine, that's how famous Skinner was. He was named one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 1970. 1970, one of the most 100 influential people. Imagine picking up Time magazine's 100 today, and instead of Mark Zuckerberg, you've got an academic PhD psychologist on the cover. You can imagine that. That's how famous Skinner was, and that's how important behaviorism was in this country. Now, eventually, behaviorism fell out of favor for some reasons we'll talk about. Basically, behaviorism couldn't explain everything, and there was a cognitive revolution in psychology that really stressed the importance of these higher mental processes and of consciousness and even unconscious processes. So let's sum up where we are. We've talked about two basic types of learning: classical conditioning, where you're learning associations. You're learning associations between events that don't necessarily have anything to do with your behavior. With operant conditioning, you're learning about the consequences of your actions. You perform a behavior or a response, and it's followed by a stimulus. It's either reinforcing or punishing, either increasing or decreasing the likelihood of you doing that again. And the big names to know, of course, are Pavlov with classical conditioning, and Skinner, Watson, and Thorndike with operant conditioning. Okay, so the last type of learning we're going to talk about is learning that occurs without any reinforcement. Learning that occurs from watching other people. Okay, so can learning occur without reinforcement? Yes, it can. The short answer to that. Learning can occur without any reinforcement. And for this, we looked to a man named Tolman. Tolman was a critic of Thorndike. He was a critic of Thorndike. He believed that behavior was best understood as a response to a goal. Response to a goal. And think about it. When you perform some sort of behavior, it's not necessarily random in the way Skinner thought of random movements on the world. You often have a goal. You're motivated to do something, to go towards something or away from something. And Tolman was stressing that. He was stressing the idea that behavior is in response to a goal, and that reinforcement has more impact on performance than on learning. That what is being reinforced is performance, not necessarily learning. So Tolman talked about something that he called latent learning. Latent learning. And he did this research with rats in a maze to show the principle of latent learning. So what he would do is drop these rats into a maze box. So if you can imagine, as you see on the slide, dropping a little rat into a maze. At the end of the maze is a reward in the form of food. So that's the reinforcement. They're getting reinforced. They're getting this reward at the very end. And he had 3 groups of rats. One group of rat in the blue line got no reward. They just plunked down in the maze. They weren't rewarded, so they'd sort of wander around. Then there was another group in the red who was regularly rewarded. Every time the rats got dunked into the maze, they got to the end, they were rewarded with food. And so this chart is showing how many errors. So basically, how good were they at getting to the end of the maze? And you can see that the group that got no reward, they weren't very good. They were consistently bad, essentially. They were consistently bad at getting to the end of the maze because they weren't being rewarded for doing so. So really, they had no motivation, if I can interpret what the rat was thinking. Then the group that was regularly rewarded, as you'd expect, kept getting better. With each trial, they kept getting better at getting to the end of the maze quickly, just like Thorndike's cat in the puzzle box. Each time the cat got put in the box, it was getting better and better at getting out to get its reward. Same thing here. Every time the rat was plunked down that puzzle box, or plunked down in the maze, I should say, they were rewarded, so they got better. The interesting part here is the third group, the no reward until day 11 group. So this group of rats got plunked down in the maze. They were just like the first group who got no reward. However, on day 10, after day 10, they got a reward. So after that, they were rewarded, and you can see what happens. They catch up to the group that was regularly rewarded pretty quickly. If you look between day 11 and 12, they're catching up and getting even better. So what's going on here? Tolman interpreted this as the fact that the rats were learning. They were learning how to get to the end of the maze. They just weren't showing how well they had learned it until there was actual need to, until they got rewarded for it. So Tolman called this latent learning, the idea that people are learning all the time, but their learning is latent. They don't show that they've learned anything until a goal is introduced. They don't show their learning until a goal is introduced, and then the learning is translated into performance. So Tolman thought that we were doing this all the time, and he called this cognitive maps. Cognitive maps. That we are, for instance, when you go to a new place, you're learning where things are all the time. You're learning where the post office, where the bank is, where the Starbucks are, where the UPS drops are, where the buildings are. You just don't know you've learned it until you have an actual need to go there. And then you realize you've learned it all along. So as we go through our everyday lives, we're picking up all this knowledge of the world around us. It's not until we have a need, a motivation, a goal, that we show we've learned where these things are. Okay. So other things that happen without reinforcement. Play. Play is something that happens without reinforcement. We just are plunked down as kids in the sandbox with other children, and we learn how to negotiate play with other kids, or even with ourselves and other toys. Our parents, put down a bunch of toys around us, and we figure out what to do with them. So play is very useful for learning how to control your behavior in effective ways, particularly around other children. And it's thought to evolve to promote practice of survival skills. So it's adaptive to learn how to figure out what to do in a new environment with new things around you. Then we have observational learning. Observational learning is another type of learning that happens without any reinforcement. So if you think about the first time you went to a baseball game, for instance, you probably had no idea what the wave was. You probably had no idea what the seventh inning stretch was until you did it for the first time. You saw everybody else around you getting up and doing it, so you followed right in. Maybe it's somebody explained it to you, but you probably just jumped right in and did it because you saw other people doing it. And even if you don't jump right in and do the behavior, observational learning helps you identify what typical, normal, usual behaviors are. Think about when you go to a different country. You can pick up the customs pretty quickly just by watching what other people do. All right, so some negative effects of observational learning. A very famous study called the Bobo doll study. Bobo doll study and a man named Albert Bandura. So Bandura was a very famous psychologist who really wanted to understand learning that occurs as a function of observation. So he thought that there was something to learning that happened without reinforcement, again, learning without reinforcement, and he focused particularly on child's aggression. So he's interested in children's aggression. So we set up this series of experiments with a Bobo doll, which I have a video for you, and I'll show you in a second. A doll about this high, inflatable doll. And basically what happened is he'd bring these children into the lab, and he would show them an adult who was basically beating up on the Bobo doll. So this adult was in the other side of the room beating up on this doll. And then they would give the child an opportunity to play with the doll. And as you'd expect, the child had learned to model this very aggressive behavior. So they went to town on the Bobo doll too. And the interesting part is they found new and interesting ways to be aggressive towards that doll beyond what they'd seen the adult doing. So let me show you the video. Hold on 1 second. Okay, so this is Bandura. All right, so here's what the child would watch. They'd come into the room and they'd be on the other side and they would watch the adult with this Bobo doll. And then they were given a chance to play with it themselves. So the little girls were just as bad. Okay, so you can see the idea. And you might be saying, well, it's just a doll. What does it really matter they were beating up an adult? But carry the principle forward. What if you saw an adult actually doing that to a real child? So the scary part here, of course, for Bandura is children might be picking up this learning just by observation, that it's okay to be aggressive, to be physically violent towards other people by watching it from others. So we do have this natural tendency to want to imitate other people, especially people of high status, people who are important and close to us. We have a tendency to want to model our behavior after others. And there are some pretty negative effects that can come out of this. Just one example. The negative effects of smoking in movies. So there's actually a lot of research to show how dangerous just observing smoking in movies can be, especially for teenagers in this critical period where they are on the cusp of possibly starting to smoke themselves. So every day in the U.S., every day, nearly 2,000 adolescents try their first cigarette. Many of them are going to go on to smoke regularly, and there are all sorts of negative effects of smoking that we know of. So is there something about watching smoking in movies that's particularly detrimental? About 70% of movies in the U.S. contain cigarette smoking, and there have been a variety of analyses that have established the percentage of adults who smoke in movies is about 20 to 25%. So 20 to 25% of characters in movies smoke. So researchers have gone on to look and see whether observing just exposure to those characters smoking in movies increases the likelihood of teenagers going on to try smoking themselves. So this chart shows that yes, the answer is yes. They did a content analysis and examined basically how much exposure these young kids between 10 and 14, how much exposure they'd had to smoking in movies. And from 1, which is very little, to 4. So the 4 quartile is the most exposure to smoking. And as you can see, the highest percentage of kids who eventually had tried smoking was in that highest exposure quartile. That, in fact, 13-year-olds who are in the highest movie smoking exposure quartile, almost 30% of them tried smoking. And this is controlling for other factors like background factors, demographic factors, personality traits, controlling for all of that, right? Statistically controlling for all of that. There was still an effect of observing smoking in movies on the likelihood of these young children, of these young adolescents, trying smoking themselves. Here's another one for you. Media and violence. You probably hear this one a lot, that there's an effect of watching aggressive, violent behavior in the media on the likelihood of you doing it again, and it's true. Research has shown both cross-sectionally and longitudinally over time that media violence increases the likelihood of both short-term and long-term aggressive behavior. And this totally makes sense. On average, a TV in the U.S. is on for 5 to 6 hours per day, and young children spend more time watching TV than doing any other activity. And again, content analysis shows that the media children are watching is pretty violent. Even Saturday morning cartoons average 2 aggressively violent acts per hour. And these are cartoons. So in one study, researchers showed that TV viewing habits at age 8 predicted the amounts of violent and even criminal behavior at age 30. So what you watch at age 8 can still be affecting you at age 30. Now, of course, correlation is not causation. There could be other variables involved. Maybe children who are more likely to watch violent TV might be more likely to be violent because of other factors. Maybe their parents or the upbringing they're in. But there is good research here to suggest a link, a strong link. And what would the mechanism be? The mechanism might be that children, by watching these media images, are learning that violence is a justifiable, common reaction. They're learning that to use violence as a means of solving problems. They're learning these very questionable social scripts for how to handle problems in their world. Okay. So is there a biological basis for this type of learning? Is there a biological basis for learning from observation? And in fact, there might be. Researchers in the last decade have been focusing on what they call mirror neurons. And mirror neurons provide a neural basis for imitation and observational learning. So researchers in Italy originally found, doing this research with monkeys, always with the monkeys, when monkeys hold something or grasp something or do some sort of motion, they found that these certain neurons in the brain are firing, and they eventually called them mirror neurons, because not only do they fire when the monkey is grasping or holding, they also fire when the monkey observes someone else doing so. So if you are observing someone doing something, these mirror neurons are also firing. And brain imaging techniques have, again, identified similar mirror neurons in humans. So humans have these mirror neurons, which are firing when we're doing some sort of action or when we are just observing someone else doing the same action. So it's thought that these mirror neurons may, in a sense, allow us to step into someone else's shoes. They may allow us to step into someone else's shoes and experience their world. That they may, in fact, be the basis for empathy, for being able to take someone else's viewpoint. Interestingly enough, people with autism, a neurodevelopmental disorder which is marked by communication difficulties among other problems, people with autism seem to have real deficits in these mirror neurons, which may explain why people with autism have difficulty understanding the emotional experiences of other people. Okay, so a final summary slide, just summing up what we've talked about the last couple of days. The 3 types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning, learning without reinforcement. I will finish up here. Have a good day, and enjoy the rest of your 120 semester.